After that huge scare, life went on. I was still on the lookout for any information about the Shroud and continued to mentor Greg. It was during the fall of 1979 when I crossed paths with a grade school acquaintance of mine named Gerard. Gerard also worked for the federal government, and whenever we saw each other on the bus I took home from work, we would chat. He saw that I was sometimes reading my Bible, so religion became one of the topics that we discussed. One day he mentioned to me that he was thinking about joining the religious life and was going to visit Pius X Abbey, a Benedictine monastery located in a small community about 45 minutes south of St. Louis. He asked if I wanted to go along for the ride, and I told him I would. The next time I saw him, he told me that he left a message at the Abbey, but no one called him back. He mentioned there was another Benedictine monastery right in St. Louis named St. Louis Priory. He was able to contact them and had arranged for a visit one Sunday in October 1979. Once again, he asked if I wanted to accompany him for the ride, and I said I would. We spent a good part of that Sunday with the monks, and I was happy to learn that one of them had an interest in the Shroud. He photocopied for me several Shroud articles that I didn't have. Although I had only come along for the ride, I actually found myself having thoughts about possibly joining the monastery. I didn't mention to anyone at my job that I was thinking of joining. A few days after I visited the monastery, while talking to someone at work about an expensive religious video that I heard about, the person said something along the lines, "You would need like a monastery to buy that and show it." My ears perked up. How often does the word monastery come up, even when talking about religious topics? Also, I was playing in a basketball league at the time and was waiting to hear from a player on another team who had been trying to arrange a practice game. I hadn't heard from him, so I called him. He said the gym he had first arranged for the game was no longer available, but he was able to line up a gym at another place. He asked, "Do you know where St. Louis Priory is at?" "I do, as a matter of fact," I replied. It was amazing. I had just visited St. Louis Priory for the first time, immediately thought about joining, and within a few days found myself back there for a recreational activity. After the game, I dropped by the monastery to say hello to the monks, and I arranged another visit. Shortly thereafter, while on a lunch break at work, I was reading a national religious periodical when my eyes were drawn to the left part of the page. An advertisement there read, "Do you like praying, being part of a community, working reasonably hard? Call Father Timothy at St. Louis Priory." All of these synchronicities happened within 2 weeks of my first visit to the monastery, which seemed to have become omnipresent in my life. The signs seemed pretty clear to me, and after some further prayer, I decided to join. On January 27, 1980, I moved to the monastery to become a postulant, which is the first stage on the path to becoming a monk. There was no commitment at that juncture. One still had all the freedoms of a layman, and one was not even clothed with a monastic habit at that point. But this was definitely a new chapter in my life. Chapter 2, Life in a Monastery, begins. I continued to work at my government job while living at the monastery. Postulants were called brothers, so I became known as Brother Joe. The monks had a weekday 6 p.m. Mass, and as I attended regularly, I became familiar with many of the people that came. Most of them, usually numbering about 30, attended on a fairly regular basis, and it was rare to see a new face. Both monks and lay people were given the opportunity to do a reading at Mass, and one night I was asked to do so. Despite the fact that I would simply be reciting the text, and it was before a relatively small group, I was very self-conscious. I had never done any public speaking before and found it rather nerve-wracking. I did the reading, but didn't dare look up, and nervously walked back to my place. At this 6 p.m. Mass, everyone was invited to stand around the altar during the Eucharistic prayer part of the Mass. When I got up to join everyone there, I was still feeling nervous from having done the reading. I said a little prayer to God that He would have to help me overcome my fear of speaking in front of people. As I said that prayer, I happened to notice a woman whom I've never seen before staring at me. Her look was piercing, and I had the odd sensation that she was actually reading my thoughts. At the sign of peace, where one gives a greeting to fellow worshipers, she came up to me, leaned close to my ear, and said, "You know, you read that very well." It was like a direct answer to my prayer. I immediately felt more confident about my ability to perform the readings. Interestingly, I never saw the woman again after that night. It was the first and only time I ever saw her. With my newly found confidence to speak in front of people and my recently purchased slides on the Shroud from the Holy Shroud Guild, I resolved to put together a slide lecture. As I was still working my government job, taking part in most of the monks' daily activities when I was at the monastery, and mentoring Greg, the only time I had to work on it was late at night. I soon found myself toiling away each night until about 2:30 a.m., and then getting up at 5:30 a.m. for the first monastic prayers of the day. I marvel now that I was able to get by with as little as 3 hours sleep. I am not a morning person. But I was much younger then and very enthusiastic about my idea of lecturing on the Shroud to others. My very first lecture was at the monastery's parish hall. The monastery ran both a parish and a school. I discovered that because of my confidence from reading at Mass and my excitement about being able to talk about the Shroud, I wasn't even self-conscious. I eventually started giving more and more lectures to churches and other groups in the area. I always tried to add several bits of humor in the slide lecture, mixing in with hard facts about the Shroud. For example, in one part I stated, Stirp applied organic and inorganic chemistry, radiography, bacteriology, immunology, volcanology, nuclear and molecular physics, entomology, mycology, endocrinology, geochemistry, pathology, hematology, physiology, ethnology, forensic medicine, criminology, photomicrography, aerodynamics, computer technology, anthropology, paleontology, and botany. They performed over 1,000, those are the ones I could pronounce. They performed over 1,000 chemical experiments employing visible, ultraviolet, and infrared photography, visible, ultraviolet, and infrared spectroscopy, X-radiography, thermography, microscopy, polarization, fluorescence, phase contact and electron microscopy, microdensitometry, biostereometry, laser microprobe spectroscopy, electron energy dispersive spectroscopy, that's just one, and microspectrophotometric transmission spectra. That gives you a good idea of the science that was put into the Shroud in 1978. Another fact I mentioned was that the man in the Shroud was about 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed about 175 pounds, which was very similar to my height and weight. Not anymore. I would then add that my parents' names were Mary and Joseph, and that people could make up their own minds regarding the relevance of all that. That would always generate a few guffaws. In August 1980, I quit my job and became a full-time monk. Other Shroud activities followed. I helped arrange to bring to the parish hall a traveling exhibit on the Shroud. The exhibit was quite large, but fortunately the hall was big enough to accommodate it. In the course of 1 week, several thousand people attended the exhibit. Sister Margaret, a nun stationed at the parish, told me one day that my name had come up in conversation with a parishioner who asked her, "Isn't that the monk who's wrapped up in the Shroud?" Little did I know that the parishioner's remark would be the inspiration 30 years later for a book title. I took the boy I was a big brother to a Shroud exhibition in Illinois, and I'll just read you the summary in one of the panels that they had there. The Stirp team concluded, "We conclude for now that the Shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved." And that is true up to this day. Dorothy Crispino, whom I had recently invited to give a Shroud lecture for the parish at the monastery and who was publisher of Shroud Spectrum International, lived in Indiana, a 5.5-hour drive from St. Louis. Dorothy invited me to come out and visit her for a weekend one summer to informally share about the Shroud. Brought along a friend named Mark Antonacci, a lawyer who's written a book himself on the Shroud. When I told her about Mark, she said to bring him along. We told other Shroud contacts about it, and several people expressed an interest to attend. Dorothy graciously hosted anyone who wanted to come, and each summer for the next few years, we had fairly large groups of people descend upon Dorothy's quaint Civil War era home. There was no official agenda. It was simply a gathering of people interested in the Shroud, discussing theories and the latest news. I'll never forget one year when Dan, a member of the group, brought his girlfriend. As Dan introduced her to us, I could tell that this gathering was the last place on earth she wanted to be. When I extended my hand in greeting, she limply shook it and didn't even make eye contact with me. Her body language shouted, "Why did I agree to come to this?" I actually felt sorry for her. I truly wondered how she was going to make it through the weekend. Soon, we were all discussing various Shroud matters. There were several discussions going on, and I decided that rather sitting in on just one conversation, I would just move around and try to hear bits of all of them. At one point, I blurted out, to no one in particular, "Isn't this great?" Dan's girlfriend looked at me in a way that I knew she was thinking I needed a mental health evaluation. However, over the course of the weekend, I could see her demeanor slowly changing, and she even started showing interest in the conversations. While she and Dan prepared to depart on Sunday afternoon, she said that she hated to leave, and I could tell she was being sincere. The Shroud bug had bitten again. Studying the Shroud helped me to feel a strong connection to God, but I also soon experienced a very strong God connection that had nothing to do with the Shroud. Every summer, the monks had an annual retreat. We owned a small house in a rural part of Missouri and often used it for that purpose. One summer, I and several other monks came down to the house a few days before the official retreat began. During one of those nights, on what was a fairly cool evening for a Missouri summer, I left a window open when I went to sleep. At one point in the night, I woke up for no reason at all. As I felt a slight breeze flow through the window, I unexpectedly experienced the palatable presence of God in the room, and I felt unconditionally loved. Although I had experienced synchronicities before, they were nothing like this. It was powerful beyond words, and it has always stayed with me. I was later to have similar experiences, and most of those did involve the Shroud. In 1985, I learned that the late Dr. Alan Adler, a chemist who was a blood specialist and a member of STIRP, would be giving a lecture on the Shroud at an American Chemical Society meeting in St. Louis. I made plans to attend and was very excited to know I would be hearing for the first time one of the STIRP scientists. After the talk, many in the audience went to speak with him, and he continued to discuss his findings informally. I hung on his every word. Little did I know that I would be seeing Dr. Adler again very soon after that. Chapter 3, Are You Going to the Shroud Conference? A few months after I heard Adler give his talk in St. Louis, I learned through my Shroud network that a conference titled The Mystery of the Shroud would be held on February 15th and 16th, 1986 in a small college town in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania.